Hello and welcome back to the very last video I will be doing at this current location. So I have mentioned in some of the other videos I've recorded over the past couple days that I am moving. I don't know which video I'm going to edit first, so please excuse me if I'm being repetitive. My name is Sean and today we will finally be diving into book 4 of Malazan, House of Chains. Malazan is a very interesting, massive series, and something that I have been realizing as I have been going through is the longer I actually participate within this series, read it, think about it, and just generally sit on it, the more and more I like it. Something I noted in some of my first videos I did for the series in books 1 and 2, while I wasn't a fan of the reading experience at the time when I was doing the review, putting the pieces together, there was something so inherently satisfying about just seeing this expansive world and then just suddenly figuring out pieces. And I, to be completely honest, was not a fan of the first 2 books because I was missing critical pieces of context that for me as a reader I desperately need in order to fully appreciate or even invest into a series. When I don't know what's happening in a book like completely and I'm just along for the ride, my brain starts kind of wondering what's going to happen and I lose that immersion very quickly. So it's something I have learned for myself from diving into Erikson's world. Book 3, I mentioned, was the first book that actually got me to the series because I had known enough about what would happen and had enough context clues to kind of understand and be along for the ride as well. But it was still a struggle to get through. Like, I got into it and I was actually enjoying the process of understanding and just the sheer epicness I really appreciated, and I had a lot of fun reading it. But until I got to this book, House of Chains, I would say that while I really enjoyed Memories of Ice, I had a blast with House of Chains. And apparently this book is pretty controversial for multitudes of reasons I'll get into. But while I think Memories of Ice is a better book, right now, House of Chains I think is my favorite. And as I'm going through these, it has been a real struggle not to just pick up the first couple books again and revisit it now that I understand what's happening. But House of Chains was the first breakthrough of that kind of closed loop that we were dealing with the first 3 books and started building out towards something really cool, and I had a blast reading this. And I think a lot of it had to do with a couple different things. One, we are moving forward with the story and with some of the context of Memory Ice. You know, we actually have a general idea of what's happening, and we've had so many pieces set up in the first 2 books and the 3rd book that when we're doing this direct continuation of it, we're having a lot of fun. And 2, we start to stick with some characters more than others, and that initial investment of Karsa, the very first character we get introduced to, just having the first book or 4 or 5 chapters dedicated to one POV that you're exploring the world through, for me I was immediately along the ride because we get to experience the world through someone who's not really a part of it in the general sense of what we've seen so far. But I'll dive into the characters and spoilers all later. Now I think this book did a lot of good in displaying some of the themes that I am noticing trending inside of the Malazan universe. Definitely the themes of kindness and redemption are at the forefront of this book. There are a lot of questions that come up here morally and with the idea of cultural relativism that I think that Stephen Erikson did a really cool job of just sitting there and make you think. And the longer you sit there after reading this book, there will be some questions where your gut reaction is like, yeah, fuck that one guy. But then when you start to think about what some of the characters have done and some of the context that happens, especially when you take into mind that Stephen Erikson is an anthropologist. So in his line of work, he got to see this and how we treat that with our own society and how we generally in the West will take our own Western ideals and apply those morals to other places. But where is the line of that? When is what's culturally moral become universally abhorrent? This book did some very interesting things. At some points were very hard to sit through. As we continue down on where it's that battle of kindness versus grimdark, I think this book really does a lot to kind of make you think, and at certain parts it's like, hey, this happens in real life, so we're just reading through this accounting, but we're not going to shy away from some of these things because they're part of the human experience and part of different cultural histories that we experience here on planet Earth. But all in all, I really enjoyed this book. I feel like you'll know if you like Malazan within the first 3 books. There was nothing that spoke to you up until this point. I don't know if you would like this one just because it has a lot of deadhouse gates in it with the context of Memories of Ice. It's definitely leaning heavy into the military side, and a large chunk of this book leans into the military portion of the genre, and I know that throws some people off. I've seen House of Chains held as like some people's favorite book, some of like their least favorite, and so for me, I really resonated with this book, and it was the first one where start to finish I was having a blast and I couldn't wait to get back into it. Between the action, the humor, and what gets set up when we actually get more glimpses into the game that's being played, all in all, I rate this pretty highly. And I know once I do a reread, my opinions on what my favorite book will probably change, because I hear that once you have a lot of this context and a lot of the callbacks that made me understand like what was happening in Deadhouse Gates, maybe that might be a better book overall. But with the context I have now on my first read through, absolutely loved it. But I'll be diving into spoilers about some of the character events and really just diving into what I thought about each different characters and events there. I'm not going to do a full plot re-dive into everything that's happening, because I don't think I know everything that's happening, just because so many pieces are moving that anything I try to map out, by the time that I put this down and read the next book, I think I'll just find that a lot of what I thought just wasn't the whole picture and flawed. So we're just going to dive into characters and some of the cooler moments, and once I do a full reread, then we'll start expanding out into more and more of Malazan. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. So to start this off, we will start with the person that had the most impact and I think stole the entire show of this book, Karsa Orlong. Karsa is one of the most interesting characters I have seen written so far in Malazan, especially given that Steven Erikson wrote it as kind of a you to a reviewer who was questioning whether or not he would even be able to write a character like that. So in response, he wrote one of the most interesting, compelling, dynamic characters I have seen so far in this series. But Karsa is a very interesting case. He's very Stone Age, immoral, Conan the Barbarian type, where his whole thing is sundering his enemies and building his own empire through the blood and tears of his vanquished enemies.
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women. That is good.
We get to watch him just do all these very immoral things, some things that YouTube would not let me say. And Steven Erikson with his character presents us with a parable of cultural relativism. Within the tableau culture, he is doing all these things that his culture has deemed to be appropriate, but we watch through his maturity and actually experience in the world at large that there was a lot more to life than what he had been presented, and the way of life that they had been doing things had been only hurting themselves. And we'll see this paralleled with some of the characters later on. But one of the things that I think draw me to him, and I think to a lot of people into liking him and just being fascinated with this character, is that Karsa is a fucking badass. And we see him go against a lot of like the benchmarks for what we know as badasses in this series. I mean, we have him punching sharks in the face. We see him eventually become the Knight of Chains, and the amount of battle he does, he makes the T-Land IMAS just look like a bunch of bitches. We see him defeat the T-Land IMAS, we see him take on these creatures that he has no business taking on and coming out victorious over and over again. And the fact that this guy, this barbarian, this whirlwind that of just craziness, that every time you put him up against a character, I think, oh no, he's gonna get his ass kicked by that person. He prevails somehow, or he just manages to find his even footing, and the fact that this just absolute reckless, like yoked barbarian is going to be the knight for the crippled god in his House of Chains is terrifying. I heard the phrase that maybe the crippled god in this situation grabbed a tiger by its tail, so it might be good for what he's trying to do, but I don't think Karsa Orlong in the future will be someone that you want to use, because we get to see what happens with that. Now, going back to the beginning, it was very interesting and fun watching his pride draw him back into conflict after conflict. He has that dance with Silgar where he raids a village, gets captured by the slave master, escapes running to the Malazans, which, side note, I think that did a great job of explaining why the Malazan Empire is so successful as it is. And it actually goes into a theme I'll talk about later, but the Malazans, through use of like clever trickery and organized tactics, were able to actually bring down Karsa after he just slaughtered an entire village. I really enjoyed when Torvald Nom showed up and was kind of the culture or civilizing force on Karsa. They had a bit of a buddy cop thing going on for me, where Karsa was the bad cop, he was the good cop. And just watching like Torvald slowly bring Karsa around as they're stuck in captivity, I really hope we see a lot more of Torvald Nom in the series, but I really like that dynamic. Also, seeing some of the encounters in here One of the craziest moments for me in the series was when he faced off against Erikson. So we have seen what Erikson can do. We've seen the devastation that he's left in his path. He is this walking nuclear missile that can destroy cities and not realize what he has done, and just a terrifying force up to this point. And then to have like Karsa knock him out and potentially win the fight, if not Mappo knocked him out. That was one of the oh shit moments like in the series, because I was not expecting him to prevail there. And then just to see him, and later on when he fights some Hounds of Darkness, just seeing the terror that he inspires and the skill was just absolutely crazy. I still don't have a good sense of like the power scales of what's actually happening in this universe, because maybe it was too early for Karsa, or he hadn't reached its full maturity and power, but having like the Keeper, you know, that archaeologist that was collecting bones that him and Torvald stumbled upon, just being able to blatantly knock him out for over 24 hours. How strong is that guy? I need to see the rest of the series and see where he actually lines up on the power scale. But later on, when he actually takes on like Hounds of Darkness, and we have other characters do run-ins with him that are already known to be great warriors, and just absolutely savagely like beat them, it's just very cool. And it's just seeing how competent and how strong this character is, and for that character to be the representative of the House of Chains is very scary. So I'm excited to see where that leads up to, and just what that giant convergence is actually going to be. And I think a lot of it, they don't realize just what they've unleashed with the crippled god and like his minions. You know, when they have the Templar gods, the seven, revealed to be Tila and Imas, and that they were actually working for the crippled god, trying to get a champion for him. Watching what he can do with the stone, making a sword that even the Tila and Imas, who are famous for their stonework, wouldn't be able to do, and then having Karsa just proceed to obliterate. You know, you can't really kill a Tila and Imas, but just wipe through 7 gods of them that are directly with the power of the crippled god. You know, we keep seeing him inspire like terror, and that confrontation was just really crazy. I mean, some of the imagery and stuff in this book, we see constant references to chains, and Karsa in particular has the ghosts of all the enemies he's slain, and like the dead Templar children just chained to him. So the imagery, the violence, the action, is just really insane just to see this character. And seeing what happens in the future, I think is going to be really epic, and I'm really curious where we're going to go with this. Even when he killed the Hounds, having Kalam and some of the bridge burners like watching from a distance and kind of looking at each other and just going, oh shit, maybe let's not mess with that guy. As he rides off on his jack horse into the distance. Just little moments like that, just absolutely, I love reading about this character. So next up, I wanted to dive into Tavore and some of the bridge burner characters that are featured within her army. Tavore is a very, very interesting character, and we only get little glimpses and hints about like her actual personality, and we're seeing some more justification for some of her actions in the previous books, but I'm actually very excited to see who she is as a character. Just from reading around the Malazan metaverse, I know that later on she becomes a much more focal point as a character, but in this book we have these little glimpses showing that she's a lot more than she comes off. In the first few books we just see her as this kind of cold, calculating character, and we don't really get to see the military genius, the great weight that she has with having to deal with what she thought was Perrin's betrayal, and then having to balance those scales with Felisen, and then the panic and responsibility she feels about rescuing her sister. All of it was just really crazy, and having a whole arc with Felisen towards the end where she doesn't realize who the Shaikh actually is and winds up stabbing her through the chest. It was just all almost like Shakespearean, and just how that played out. But some of the things that I think were the most interesting that stood out was in some of Felisen's flashbacks, she would remember like Tavore being in Perrin's shadow, so always doing sword work, setting up poor soldiers made of like bone and antler, and trying to win unwinnable battles. You know, the different veteran characters referring to her as like Cold Still, and reminiscent of Coltane and just her leadership style. And when we see her dealing with some of the troops in the Omens, where the 14th Legion goes and to deal with one of the Omens that pops up, they try to steal a bunch of bones from a graveyard, and she sees everyone wearing bones as an attempt to escape their inevitable fate. And instead of saying like, hey, that's not in regulation, or hey, that's an issue, she's like, okay, we want these all in regulation order, so make sure everyone's wearing the bones the exact same way. And not only that, she's additionally wearing it So some of the social keenness that you're seeing with her, and then how she handles the battle, some of the strategic decisions she made, I just think she is a very interesting character overall. And within that army, there's a lot of interesting things happen. This book happens after the Chain of Dogs. So we have a lot of characters that are still reeling from that battle, and Malazan's been at war for a while now. And we're seeing that take its toll on the soldiers. They are tired. They don't want to go there. Even their most resolute characters like Fiddler, who has gone through campaign after campaign, the thoughts of desertions and just being done with it all are just ever present in the despair. And throughout this despair, we're seeing a lot of the grim soldiery humor. One thing that has surprised me about Erikson, because I don't think he was in the military, was he does a really good job at capturing that kind of weird, absurd, grim humor that you have when you are a soldier. When you're going through things that just suck so much, you get these little quirks and that camaraderie that you build up in there. I think that Erikson does one of the better jobs I've seen ever done in military fantasy at really displaying that. But diving into Fiddler specifically, it was really cool to see him come back. The humor that was him re-enlisting as strings and getting some of the background of the bridge burners, I thought was really cool. And some of his character arcs in like this book I thought were especially well done. When he finally learns of like Whiskey Jack's death and dives into despair, but even in his like darkest moment, he sees Teamer and he wants to like help him, so he goes and, you know, puts someone else before himself and really upholds that ideal. I just thought that was like a really good tender moment and just super well done. And throughout all of this, we see that Tano Spirit Walker song that was mentioned earlier on, that's starting to have an effect. So even though that we have lost like Whiskey Jack and some of the other bridge burners, there's something happening behind the scenes. So they are getting pulled to ascendancy, or whatever that means. Fiddler and Kalam and some of the other bridge burners keep hearing this like Tano song that's pulling them towards something. And I'm super excited because that might mean that we get a re-emergence of like Whiskey Jack and some of the other bridge burners we lost. You know, throwing all the other weird ascendant supernatural powers that we were seeing with like Perrin and some of these other characters. I'm super excited to see what happens with that. Also, this is I think a theme of the book, but in this like army scenes and military scenes, something that is interesting and as like a historical comparison is that we're really seeing the battle between like military discipline and society against like the wild barbaric tribes and the less organized versions of that. We've seen that battle play out in history. The Romans defeated the Gauls and fighting the different barbarians of the West. The Romans weren't these massive warriors that were just much more stronger or had better like battlefield prowess in the sense of just individual combat. They were better because they were able to organize and have supply chains, and they could go in a spot, work together, and use like that group synergy to really overcome their enemies. And with Tavore and the army that's going up against like some of these other ones, and throughout the series we were seeing just how well that pays off. Even in a scene with like felisen talking about like cold steel and hot steel, with how Coltane like eventually died. They were saying it took 9 out of 10 battles before they even got to the chance for Coltane to even be defeated, and that required a lot of treachery and a lot of extra magic to even make it happen. Watching what that military actually takes to form and march, and every little piece of that just military war machine go into battle was just super cool. And I also like that little wink of that flashback with Tavore as a child playing with little toy soldiers made out of antlers and bone. That's just kind of like a future wink to the TLN eye mask. You know, super well done, little tricks hidden. Next is getting into my boy Kalam. Up until this point before Karsa, I would say he was the most interesting character for me. I really like Perrin and a few of the others, but just whenever you have a good assassin arc, I am all about it, and this one didn't disappoint. We start in with little details. We find out that Kalam got married to Manalia, and that actually led to a pretty humorous exchange between him and Cotillion, where the god of assassins is basically like, sorry, I don't do marital affairs. But we get to see Kalam do a bunch of cool assassin shit in this book and do a little setups. What has happened with those 1,300 crucified children and how they're actually becoming the Company of Shadow. Very excited to see what happens with that, but just cool little things where, while I don't say his arc was the most in-depth and most that happened with it, you get a lot of world building through what is happening with him just from his interactions with Cotillion and some of the places he's going. I think there are really just 3 major points that I want to talk about with Kalam that I especially enjoyed in this book. The first one was when he joined Sergeant Cord and they were trying to treat him like they would any other soldier. So they're like, oh, you're Corporal Kalam, well I'm Sergeant Cord. and you need to do what I say. And Kalam's just like, okay, well, I'm gonna say that I'm just a master of claw again, and by the way, I just released a giant demon that wiped out a company in like 3 seconds. So, you guys want to deal with that, or shall I? And they're like, no, go ahead, Master Claw, please, go ahead. We've seen the bridge burners repeatedly get demoted, and I didn't talk about it with like Fiddler, but he's back to being a sergeant, so just, it's a running thing where you have these very high-level officers and bridge burners that have been in positions of power get busted down back to like corporal or sergeant just to show a message, and having Kalam be the master of the claw, be a corporal, which is pretty damn low in the army, having regular sergeants trying to boss him around, I just found that very humorous. And that seems to happen a lot with the bridge burners in these scenarios, where they are just absolute legends that just keep throwing back into the situations with the regular soldiers, and people don't realize just the sheer absurdity of what they have done and just how like actively like badass they actually are. The second part was after Kalam got injured. I don't know why, because I had like a lukewarm reaction to Croup, but maybe going back I would like him. But when Kalam gets injured and he has to deal with Iskalar Pusk, and just something about the interaction of him just being annoying and the whole shadow stuff, like just having Kalam too injured to leave and just having to deal with the constant pestering of Iskalar Pusk, especially with his wife, I just found that whole scene hilarious and just really enjoyed it. And lastly, I think his like arc finished off super strong. So when he is finally at that convergence and he starts seeing that the Talon are actually there and he's there on a mission with Cotillion, watching him do battle against the Talon and just having a really cool assassin off, I thought was awesome to see. We get to see like just how powerful he is as a character, and then just how much more powerful Cotillion is. But just having that arc finish off with just, you know, assassin battle, him doing sneaky through the shadows, having a full-on knife battle, and just watching just him survive a situation that he shouldn't have, along with some of the character stuff that comes along with it. Like when he has that interaction with like Bidithal and you see what happens to Silgar, just a lot of creepiness. Watching how Kalam reacts in the situations just to culminate in like an awesome, cool final battle. Just, I love me some assassin stuff. Now next I wanted to talk about Cutter and Apsalar's art, or Crocus, for those of you who get confused with the names, because I think that there were going to be a lot more name changes in Malazan to keep up with. But this was probably one of the less impactful arcs for me, except that I loved all the interactions with Cotillion. And I think just as a world building tool and explaining out the plot, that it was a very cool arc to watch. Cutter and Apsalar, they are having some serious misunderstandings. You know, Apsalar is worried that Cutter is attracted to Sari and all the assassin stuff she was, and that's not actually her, even though that's a layer of her, while Cutter is trying to become more and more of that person that he saw in Sari, just so that he can relate, show Apsalar, you know, he actually cares with her. And so they have this hard sort of misunderstanding between the two of them, where they both love each other, but they're focusing on the wrong things, and you have that constantly going back and forth, with Cotillion being pretty level-headed towards this, but definitely like a wedge that is going into their relationship. Now, during some of these, we may have stumbled actually on the plot of Shadow Throne and Cotillion. They might just be trying to seize the power of all the thrones to proceed to do nothing with it. And I love that idea, because throughout this series, it's saying you don't want to have the gods' attention, you don't want the gods to come in and ruin your stuff. They will wreck your shop, whatever you do, never ask for a god's attention. So the idea that they had this whole plot and plan that would make them give up the empire, ascend, and try to finally stop this craziness that's happening from above. I just absolutely love that as a premise. And when we start to get more into the motivations of why these gods and characters are doing what they're doing, it just gives me so much more plot and context to work with. And even knowing that, we still have the cripple god in place. So now we have just starting to have these factions of gods form that will be doing battle on this grand scale, and we just, all these moving pieces and all this complexity is just something very much for me to look forward to in the next books. And some critical knowledge that happened in here, finding out that Shadow Throne actually isn't sitting on the Shadow Throne, but actually the first throne of the IMAS, I thought was a cool little misdirect. And that bittersweetness of the end, where Apsalar, not wanting Cutter to follow her, continuously be influenced by Cotillion, decides to become Cotillion's too and runs off into the distance distance with them, while he instead becomes the protector of Felisen the Younger, and we'll dive more into Felisen the Younger a little bit. But just the bittersweetness of it, seemed like this entire thing was just a giant misunderstanding. But as we go through Malazan, there is a lot of darkness, a lot of awareness that happens in the series. It's absolutely brutal. So I feel like a lot of the characters don't have that calm areas to reflect and mature as characters, because instead there's gods and dragons and all these things constantly messing with them, and they're in such a fight for their life that they can never really calmly step back and reflect and communicate. Next up is Onrack and Trull. So I don't have a lot to say about these guys. I enjoyed their interplay and dynamic, but I feel like they were setting up something larger than inside this book that just you didn't really get the full picture of. You did get to have some experiences with other races and stuff that I just don't have the context to understand for, so I didn't really latch on too much for these characters. The big thing that I think really stood out was that Onrack cheated on his wife with Kalava, and knowing that she was one of the only Talon to actually escape the curse of the IMS. It's very kind of interesting, just lore points. And the fact that his wife that he cheated on became the vengeance-obsessed whirlwind goddess, I thought was just a nice little tie-in, full circle moment. But really, I think his whole character arc in this book was just to really showcase the curse of the IMAS and show that all the downsides to what happens when you hit that immortality. And in the beginning and early in the book, we have apsalar actually give us a quote that talks about why would you ever want to ascend and why that's just such a terrible idea. And to paraphrase a piece of it, could life not be called a mortal's first lover? A lover's who embraced was then rejected in that fire crucible of ascendancy. So ascendancy may not be everything that we make it out to be. It could be a curse. We know with the Tinlan Aimas, especially through his perspective, that it very much is a curse. And Trull, I haven't had enough time with Trull to really decide whether I like him or not. I'm pretty neutral on him. It's similar to how I feel about Krupp. I think when we revisit him later on in the series and I see more things with him or have more context, I think he'll be a very interesting character. So we know that his brother has done some really shady things, and he has betrayed his tribe, which sounds like for the good of the rest of the world, but once again, not enough context to really understand what's happening there or to fully appreciate who he is as a character. And lastly, I wanted to dive into Heboric and Felisen. Starting with Felisen, her whole story arc was extremely tragic. She just kept getting dealt bad hand after bad hand. In this book, as Shaik, we just see how consumed she is by Onrack's crazy ex-wife. Saying some of this stuff out loud just makes me realize just how absurd and crazy some of Erikson's plots and themes are. I go back to laser raptors in the last book. But Felisen is very much out of control in this. She is trying to do some good, and she tries to build up her orphans, and Felisen the Younger, I think, is a good example of this, trying to give someone a life that she had just cruelly taken away from her, but she is so consumed by the vengeance of her goddess that she's just very much not in control. Heboric, I always thought, was an interesting character. Just being called Ghost Hands in particular is just such a cool name, and it was such an interesting path with him and Finner and just some of the powers he has. We don't understand anything about that power, but in this book, having him become the destriant for Treach and becoming another member of the God of War's house, I just thought was very interesting. Tiger people getting into some more Thundercat type action and seeing how that was in the last book. I'm excited for more of it. One of the things that happened in this book was that Heboric brought Felisen into his church and for a moment briefly got rid of the whirlwind's influence over her, and we see her just immediately come back to senses, and it's hey, where's Felisen the Younger? I haven't seen her in days, and rationality comes back to her, and he realizes just how little in control Shaik actually is, or Felisen is, when she is Shaik. So when he pushes her back, all thoughts that aren't vengeance just completely fly out of her head. And I think her arc is one of the things that best sort of showcases some of the themes of this book. One thing in particular is Bidethal, where Bidethal, everybody knows he is going to do some horrific things to Felisen the Younger and to the other places, and some people will be no, don't do that. Felisen wouldn't like that. And he knows he's in such a position that he can get away because he has that power. And what happened was he did get away with it to a point where, because that he had the power and Shaq needed him, he was able to just do some horrific things to Felisen the Younger. Now, he got his due later on in the book, but at the time, it took everyone who was part of Shaq's party. They knew he did something truly horrific and did nothing about it. They knew he was going to do something about it, but because he had that, no one was willing to stand up and just do something. And you compare that to like Karsa Orlong, who doesn't care about the power or the uses or anything. He just goes up and was like, you know, I told you if you did this, there would be consequences, and proceeds to give a mouthful of consequences. But we see that in our real world all the time. And I'm not going to do direct comparisons or get into the conspiracy theories that are out there, but we see that a lot, and I've seen it in the business world, where when people have power and use to other people that are at the top, then we see people getting away with immoral things that they shouldn't be. And I think this book does a great job of making me think about some of these morally relative questions. I think, too, the whole vengeance versus justice theme in this book, we keep seeing vengeance come up, and just how that twists and warps the people inside of it. You know, the whirlwind goddess turns out to be Onrack's betrayed ex-wife, who was so mad that she escaped the ritual of the Imas and instead wound up just getting thrown into the Raku Desert, where she stumbled upon the shard and became a force of nature unto herself. But just the whole arc was pretty sad, and then having it finish off with Tavore just stabbing Felisen through the chest without realizing it. I'm very curious to see how Tavore reacts to that later on when she finds out that was actually Felisen, but very, very dark. Very dark. Oh, this is gonna be like an hour-long video. I overall really enjoyed this book, and the big thing with these books that I'm reading in Malazan is that while I might appreciate it like at the finishing of reading it, and it feels like an accomplishment to get through it, after sitting on these books for a while, that's when just the true epicness and mastery and just how cool these books actually are. The longer I sit on these books, the more I enjoy them. And it's in the putting them together and getting all the pieces and just realizing all the cool little tricks that Erikson just pulls in here, and the skill that he's really showcased, that I am getting hooked into the series. One of the biggest ones was like the cultural relativism. Towards the end of the book, I think most people would like Karsa, even though he started at a very rough place. But you know, you get asked the question, he had the chance for redemption to become a better character. Well, what about Bidethal? He did some very horrific things as well. If he was given the correct chance and time and circumstances, could he also be redeemed? I'd say no. But these are the type of questions that you want to ask, because Malazan ultimately is a story about like kindness and redemption. And I will say, I have gone through the tour rereads of this chapter by chapter just to get like good summaries and just to make sure I'm not missing anything. I'm sure I did miss some things that I just didn't include in this video, but at one point a reader asked a similar question to Steven Erikson, and he answered about this question in particular, where that while yes, this book is about redemption and that is one of the greatest ideals of humanity, there are some people like Bidethal that we know in real life that just probably shouldn't be redeemed. Some people are truly awful, and it's just hard for them to make it. Does everyone have the potential to be redeemed? Sure. Will everybody be redeemed? Probably not. But 4 books into the series, I am having a really crazy time getting through this. I'm going to pick up Midnight Tides, and I'm hoping I can get this out in like a month, now that I'm really starting to pick up steam with these books. But just getting through them takes so much, and they're so dense that it just becomes all-consuming with whenever I try to record or make one of these videos. But just so you guys are aware, I am fully planning on rereading this series twice. Once I finish all the books in the first reread, I want to do a what I think about Malazan on the first read, and I don't know if I'm going to do book by book or maybe volume by volume, but I will definitely re-review these books coming at it from a new perspective, because I do feel like I missed a lot in the first 2 books and wasn't able to fully appreciate them just because I was so lost, like searching for context, that I'm really curious just how I will take the series in a second time. And I think that with all the things not explained and not having that context, that this is a very rereadable series, and I do think that reading it the second time I will have a much different experience. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. This is going to be a longer video like all of my Malazan videos, and hopefully I didn't ramble too much. There is going to be a lot of work that future Sean's going to have to do in editing. The best part about Malazan for me right now is just laying everything out, seeing the scope, and trying to piece everything together, and just a mad try of comprehension and understanding. But hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and as always, take it easy.